pictures of their like concept or like they had pictures of there was one.
Great, thanks everyone for coming. This is Strong Female Characters, Feminist Conversations in Science Fiction and Fantasy. I am Desiree Schell. I'm the host of Skeptically Speaking, which is a local science radio program. It's syndicated at this point and it's broadcast across North America. And what we usually talk about on the show is sort of the intersection of science and social issues. We tend to talk a lot about that. So here we're talking about the intersection of science fiction and social issues, so it's really not much of a departure. And why don't I have you guys introduce yourselves? Sam Power.
I'm Sam Power. For my day job, I'm the news editor at View Weekly. I do a show on CJSR as well, Heavy Metal Lunchbox, every Friday at noon. And in my spare time, I consume anything related to science fiction.
Awesome.
My name's Jocelyn Saskiw. I spent about 5 or 6 years doing Adam and Eve, a feminist radio show here in Edmonton. And I just moved out to Athabasca about 1.5 years ago. So I spent a lot of my time reading and watching TV and playing on the internet.
Hi, I'm Rachelle Saunders. I am the president of the Greater Edmonton Skeptics Society and the director of a local science outreach event called LogicCon, and have been an ardent science fiction and fantasy geek for as long as I can remember.
So let's start out by talking about some examples of science fiction and fantasy characters that actually do stand up under a feminist critique. And we'll start with you.
So, just sort of off the top of the head, there's some obvious ones that kind of jump out. Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There's a ton of well-written female characters there. And quickly, just to clarify, when we're talking about characters we feel stand up under a feminist lens, we're not necessarily talking about characters that are themselves feminists. We're talking about characters that are well-rounded, both male and female, that don't kind of fall as easily under tropes or stereotypes that kind of haunt us in science fiction and fantasy when we're talking about especially women characters. So Starbuck from Battlestar Galactica, as well as President Roslin.
What's your reasoning behind that?
For President Roslin?
For both.
For both. Starbuck, I love on Battlestar Galactica because the women are as well-rounded and are as full of failure as a lot of the male characters. If you look at President Roslin as a great example of somebody who tries really hard. She finds herself in a position of power. She goes from being, a school teacher to being the president of basically all of the humans left in the galaxy. And she tries to do what she thinks is right, and sometimes she has to do it. Sometimes the choices that she makes lead her to make very bad decisions or very difficult decisions. And she's a very human character. She fails and succeeds, oftentimes in equal parts. And like her or hate her, she's a very good example of a very human character. Starbuck in the same way. Starbuck is an interesting twist on Battlestar Galactica because, of course, in the original series, Starbuck was played by a male character. So they twisted that and brought some of the original Starbuck personality into a more female role. And there's a lot about Starbuck that is very masculine. But there is also, in places, a lot about Starbuck that remains very feminine, which is quite nice to see that you don't have to sacrifice everything that is feminine in order to create a more masculinized, tough, taking nonsense character.
And we're going to break down some of those ideas as we go on. But your characters?
I know it's not as popular, but I want to talk about Star Trek Voyager. And I mean, an obvious one would be Captain Janeway because she's a female captain. And I like her because she's not a mother figure and she's not a lover to anybody. But one of my other favorite characters was Seven of Nine. And it was kind of hard to watch the show because we finally get a Star Trek that has a female captain, which is kind of a crappy show. And then they put in this really excellent character where, like, I love the Borg. I loved all the stories about the Borg, but they have her wearing a boob suit, and which is really, I mean, why do that? Like, why have a female captain and then have a really overly sexualized character? Although she was one of my favorite characters. And my other favorite feminist character is Jakar from Babylon 5. And it's a male character, and it's partially because feminism isn't just about women, it's about all kinds of class issues. And the stories that they did with him, because he was really angry at the beginning, and he was kind of a total, like, he had a lot of issues because he was, you know, a part of the slave race. And I liked it because they made him scary looking, kind of like the Cardassians, except he was the one that was the oppressive race. And there was a lot of, like with the Centauri, I mean, if you watched the show, but he later became an ambassador for peace. And all of the stories around him, Jakar was definitely my favorite character.
Let's talk about Janeway. Would you like to start?
Okay, honestly, like, I don't like Janeway, and I could debate for a while as to why I don't like Janeway. I stopped watching the show because I don't like Janeway. But just a few points that actually my friend helped me define were her leadership is constantly questioned by her crew. She's continually depicted somewhere between a very mannish character or a very momish character. My friend described her as the mom of Star Trek Voyager, which isn't in itself a bad thing, but in the context of the show, it doesn't play very well. She is sexually non-existent, and she's used, she's used to reinforce the idea that women can't be rational. So, that's my perspective on Captain Janeway.
And I would also add that she's the only captain, and I could be wrong, someone I'm sure will correct me if I am, but I think she's the only character who shows open concern about getting involved in relationships because she is the captain. No other captains do that.
That's what I liked about it though, like she wasn't, it was nice to have a female character that wasn't in a romance. Because usually you do have the one token female character, and they're always, like I'd like to see a movie or a show or read a book where she isn't somehow romantically involved with somebody else. I didn't get the impression that she was mothering at all, but I did read some interviews that the actress did, because they had so many different writers on the show that her character was kind of, in some episodes she would stick to the prime directive no matter what, and in other ones she would throw it away. But I think that she was put in a pretty unique situation, being stranded in the Delta Quadrant, and because they were so far away from Starfleet, like it is controversial. I mean, they're so far away, why still stick to the prime directive? But I like Captain Janeway.
I just want to clarify one thing. I actually don't like Captain Janeway as a character, but I like that I don't like her. A perfect example of this kind of outside of the sci-fi bubble would be, I'm a big Harry Potter fan, so the character of Dolores Umbridge, I hate that character, but I love her because I hate her. And that's one of the things I really like about Captain Janeway, is she fails a lot, and it's a very human thing, it's a very real thing to fail in a position of power under extraordinary circumstances, and to struggle with that, and to try and find an identity for yourself in a very particular situation. And leaving the quality of the writing aside, because I think sometimes Voyager had some writing issues, there were some interesting choices made for her. The decision not to have her as a central romantic character. There were lots of romances that played out on Voyager, but they tried to stay away from giving her or making her that romantic character. And I think it was quite an interesting choice to take a captain and someone who probably was trying very hard to be that captain figure and to be that highest ranking officer and to be a leader, and she internalized that. It was just an interesting choice, and I like her because she felt very real.
Now, do you think that's problematic from a feminist perspective, though? Making her so very real that she is potentially viewed as more flawed and more vulnerable than the male character?
One of my biggest struggles when we're talking about female characters is female characters tend to get given a lot of guff for the flaws that they do have. Either they're too perfect or they're too flawed. And we tend not to give the same critique of male characters. We tend to overlook a lot of the same character traits or personality traits, or love them when we see them in male characters as opposed to female characters. Going back to my Harry Potter roots, if you're talking about a character like Severus Snape, who has a huge number of faults, he's basically as many character faults as you can put into a character in one. If that character had been female, there would have been a lot more controversy. That character wouldn't have been universally loved. And there's really no reason for that. The character doesn't stop being well-rounded because they're female instead of male. So when you're getting into the Doctor Who fandom, a character like Martha gets a lot of flack. Lots of people hate her. They find her to be a really, really weak character. They find a lot of those characters to be very flawed, and they're held up as examples of badly written characters. But I think that flaws are important, and the idea of having a character, male or female, who is inherently more flawed than they have positive character traits is part of everyday life. You meet people who are not very great people, and that's okay. What about your characters?
Okay, well, I'll start by saying that in evaluating my characters, I looked at,
She's very organized.
in evaluating my characters, I did start by using the Bechdel test, which is sort of the test that is applied to pop culture storylines to judge if it stands up under a feminist critique. And the Bechdel test asks if the storyline includes two women who have one conversation that is not about men. Basically, everything fails this test. So I threw that out, and I evaluated my characters based on their ability to challenge gender stereotypes, and their ability to, as Rachelle said, to encompass a whole perspective, a whole being. And of course, characters from books and television are going to have better opportunities to exemplify that because books are often longer and TV shows have episodes that different things happen. So, so those types of, that type of literature and storyline are often easier to find feminist characters. I also really wanted to look at how the characters challenged gender stereotypes. So I actually chose Captain Jack as one of my characters because he is a bisexual male, or omnisexual, I guess, as John Barrowman likes to call him. And he challenges stereotypes because he is both feminine and masculine, and he's allowed to be that. The writers also depict him falling in love with other men, falling in love with women, falling in love with anything that moves, which is also it just challenges the idea of gender and heteronormativity that exists in a lot of sci-fi and literature in general. And so it is a great imagining of where gender and love and those types of ideas will be in the future, as we should be doing with science fiction. Captain Jack was the first person I thought of. I actually think that Torchwood is a really great feminist show, if people know Torchwood. Gwen and Reese. Gwen is sort of the main, I guess, human character in the show, and she's chosen to be part of the Torchwood team because she is that human character, because she is willing to tap into her feelings and emotions to guide what Torchwood does. But at the same time, she's extremely strong. She pushes a lot of the storylines forward, and she also, in terms of her relationship with Reese, I think the writers did a really good job of putting Gwen in the driver's seat in that relationship. Her career drives their relationship, but they still have children. They're still building that up. Reese is the primary caregiver in that family, pretty much, which I think is fantastic. Challenges stereotypes and is one of the few shows to actually let that happen. My friend and I were actually discussing Chief O'Brien as well from Deep Space Nine and his relationship with Keiko. Yeah, and we actually decided that he was a feminist character as well because Keiko O'Brien, they share the parenting role pretty well, like it's pretty equal. There are certain exceptions, of course, in any relationship, but they did a pretty good job of depicting that. I think Deep Space Nine actually does a really good job of depicting relationships in general. Like Cisco is allowed to have a family, which doesn't happen very often. Okay, so I also chose Laura Roslin from Battlestar Galactica, and for the similar reasons, because she is very flawed, but also in the context of the show, she's not depicted as she's not depicted as a female leader who is flawed in comparison to someone like Adama, who's, this fantastic military leader who makes all these great decisions. All the leaders in that show are horribly flawed. They're all driven by their emotions. They all make awful mistakes, and it's this great, it's this great story that happens because of that.
Just a quick side note with Laura Roslin. One of the things I loved about Battlestar Galactica immediately is they start out by depicting Adama as going to be the dominant leader and Roslin will fall under him, and she says, screw that, really, really fast. And the show is very good at keeping those two characters who are leading different parts of the sort of remaining human survivors as co-leaders and as equals. And that's a hard thing to do without falling under some sort of, you know, marriagey stereotypes.
Yeah.
But they do a really, really good job of having those two characters drive the story equally without necessarily having their inevitable romance get in the way of like, they can be sort of have this romantic tension without that determining their entire course and all of their decisions. I thought it was a very well done character pairing.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I really like in the very first episode or that first 2-hour miniseries, I really like that. I mean, Roslyn stood up and she won that argument with Adama. She basically said, like, the only way we're going to win is if we start reproducing and we admit that we've lost this war and get out of the way. And Adama realizes that, and so that it's sort of their first great like co-leadership decision, I guess. Can I do one last character?
Totally.
Okay, so my last character is Catelyn Stark, and I know Jocelyn disagrees with me. But obviously not sci-fi, but from Game of Thrones, she's Ned Stark's wife. She's the Lady of Winterfell. I think she's she has a political mind. She immediately understands that Ned Stark has to accept the position of the Hand and move to King's Landing for their house and their position to ensure their survival, as every decision is in Game of Thrones. She does have a female relationship. She passes the Bechdel test. She has a relationship with Brienne, her guard, and they discuss things more than men. They discuss political implications of what's going on. She also has a relationship with her sister, in which they discuss the political implications of the whole thing. We can argue on whether Catelyn Stark was right or not, because she did make some interesting decisions. But she did have. She didn't understand the politics of the time and knew how to hold the strength of her family and her house and that sort of thing. And she demonstrates that in negotiating with the Freys and attempting to broker an alliance between Stannis and Renly, the Baratheon brothers. She attempts to maintain peace in the realm before everything implodes.
So I have a couple of questions here. I'm sure you guys do too, but I'm sick. So, first of all, one of the things that I find interesting is when we talk about feminist characters or seeing characters through a feminist lens, one of the things that people usually assume is that the female characters are sort of masculinized in a way. So would you say that actually applies to these characters?
A lot of them. I think part of it is a lot of characters that we tend to point to are ones that challenge gender stereotypes. But I think it's just as easy a way to point to characters that don't necessarily always challenge those gender stereotypes as effectively. A great example, this isn't really a sci-fi example though. Hang on, I'll think of one.
I'll propose Ellen Ty as an example from Battlestar.
Oh, yeah.
She's extremely feminine. And in the beginning, you're almost worried for her character. But I really like what the writers did with her character, and she became very powerful. And it turned out that she actually, I don't know if people watch it, I don't want to give it away, but she turns out to be a very powerful character. But while at the same time, she's a wife and she is extremely feminine.
So one thing that you both have brought up as well is, or two of you have, is you picked males for two of your characters. So would you say that these are traditionally masculine characters, or would you say that they were not?
In some ways, yeah and no. We all know that there's a difference between a feminine character and a masculine character, but it's not that black and white. masculine characteristics like being strong or having a political mind, they're not just for men. Women have those things, like we're all people. But I partially picked a male character just because feminism is for everybody. It's not just for women. And feminists aren't just concerned about women's well-being, they're concerned about everybody's well-being.
Yeah, I would say that I chose my characters based on the idea of their ability to embody whatever gender characteristics they desire, which I think is really true of characters like Captain Jack and characters like Wash from Firefly. He's not a traditionally, he's not the traditional male, but he's a great character.
And I would actually argue that Kaylee and Simon also have a non-gender typical relationship.
Firefly is really interesting from a gender perspective when you're talking about the entire show, and Joss Whedon's sort of mindset from a character perspective as well is quite interesting. But with specifically Firefly, he makes an active effort to spin some stereotypes on their head, which he does with a lot of shows. And if you actually look at Buffy the Vampire Slayer from its incarnation, that show was specifically taking well-known stereotypical characters and spinning them as much as possible. If you look at the idea of the blonde, white Valley Girl cheerleader who was a very physical, like strong, as in the physical sense of strong character. If you look at the character of Cordelia Chase, who comes off as this sort of vapid, mean girl, but she's incredibly smart, and they establish that very quickly on the show. She's no slouch. She tells it like she is. She tells it like she sees it, which in a lot of cases people qualify as a very valuable and positive character trait, to sort of have this no-nonsense, call you out right away. And when you get to characters like Wash and Zoe, where they flip some of those expectations on their head, same thing with Kaylee and Simon. Kaylee is the more sexually free pursuer, whereas Simon becomes a little bit more repressed and a little bit more of not the ability to be free. And of course there's some class characteristics that play out with Kaylee and Simon, as well as a female masculine stereotyping as well.
We've been talking a lot about character. Let's talk a bit about plot. One of the things that I find so interesting is the fact that science fiction and fantasy is supposed to be escapism to a certain extent. So if it is supposed to be escapism, why are we reproducing the same tropes that we see in real life in a lot of ways? In terms of, and some of the worst aspects of this world is what I'm talking about. If somebody could explain the refrigerator trope?
Who here has heard of the refrigerator trope? All right. So just as a side note, if you go to tvtropes.org, you'll get lost there forever. It's really fun. But the refrigerator trope comes from, I believe it's a comic, is the history. And what happens is there's this idea of the female who drives the male to do something. So this female character, it's a very common trope in media, especially science fiction, fantasy, and comics, where there's a male character who has a female, a girlfriend, a mother, a sister, a daughter, a friend, some kind of female association, and that female gets unceremoniously slaughtered. She gets killed, she gets murdered, she dies, something happens. Raped is a really good example, and that incites upon the male character a change in his character that usually results in some kind of revenge and some kind of social activism, some way to sort of take advantage of the story. And the female character's role in the entire story is as a catalyst. She has no character unto herself except as a plot point. If she had not been killed, then he would not have taken the step that he did. Something about her death caused him. It's seen as a causation link. And it comes from a comic where the male protagonist finds this female head, she gets killed, and he finds her head in a refrigerator. So that's sort of where the name of the trope comes, is these women who get written into stories as ways to get the males to do something. They're plot points rather than people.
So I think we can see how that's problematic.
Well, there's nothing really wrong with that in a story. It's just that it happens a lot, like a lot. And they started a website, I think Gail Simone did, where she started recording how often this was happening in comic books, and it keeps getting added to all the time. But some of the commentary about it is maybe part of the reason that these female characters are mutilated is because they're often secondary characters. And I mean, think Star Trek, you know, the one that you don't really know always gets killed off. So it could either be just overt misogyny, or it could be that the females are often not the main characters, so they're not important, so they can easily be killed off.
Do you want to add?
To that point, particularly, well, in terms of, okay, in general, like, this question makes me uncomfortable.
The question about why do we keep continuing the same tropes?
Yeah.
We have the advantage of being able to do basically anything in this world. Why are we presenting it like this?
Yeah.
That you have a problem with.
It makes me uncomfortable because I love science fiction, and so it's very disappointing to me that science fiction, where we should be imagining these amazing possibilities of what we could be capable of, continues to tell the same stories that are stuck in, you know, this century's thinking. It makes me want to cry, pretty much. Like, just the very idea, if you think of the very first, what was supposed to be the first episode of Star Trek in the 60s, there was supposed to be a second in command who was female. She was supposed to be, you know, commanding a starship, and they prevented Star Trek from doing that. They prevented Roddenberry from doing that. And it's extremely disappointing that we continue to limit ourselves in our thinking for whatever reason in terms of gender. So in terms of this presentation, I wanted to focus on the positives of what sci-fi has done. And that sci-fi, a lot of science fiction writers are taking on the ideas of gender, heteronormativity, and things like that. If you look at some of Ursula Le Guin's writing, I think the Left Hand of Darkness is always used as an example. It's a genderless society, and if you read that book, it's a really interesting evaluation of how our gender constructs inform what we do today and what they could do if they didn't exist, and things like that. So I don't know if I answered the question.
Well, and I think you did, but while Ursula K. Le Guin's books exist, and those kind of explorations do exist, what we mainly see when something goes from, for example, a book to the big screen, or a book to a TV series, it's not necessarily those kind of reevaluations. What we see are the things that do reproduce what I think are the worst aspects of society.
Well, I'll use an example in Game of Thrones. If you've read Game of Thrones and then watched the HBO series, I was extremely disappointed in two depictions where Catelyn Stark in the books, she makes the decision that Ned has to leave and be the Hand. Like, she's the one who talks him into that. And then in the series, she turns into this whiny lady who doesn't want her man to leave. And it's really disappointing that they did that. And the second example is Daenerys. I think Jocelyn and I disagree on this as well, but should I?
No, keep going.
Yeah, like Daenerys' relationship with Drogo. In the books, to me, it's not depicted as a rape on their wedding night. Like, in the books, in reading that chapter, to me, it's the first time that, okay, the situation itself is awful. She's sold as a bride. Like, her brother sells her. That's awful. But Drogo attempts to make the best of it. Like, he he attempts to care about what she maybe wants, and it is an example of why she turns away from her brother, who has sold her for his own power, to this culture that maybe is going to accept her as a leader, and look to her for leadership. So, and then in the series, they just turned it into a rape scene. Yeah.
Now, proving that feminism and women are not a monolith. What's your opinion on it?
Oh, Game of Thrones?
That particular aspect of it.
Okay, we were just talking about tropes, and rape, like women getting raped, is a pretty big trope. It's something that happens in a lot of stories, and I'm on the second book, Clash of Kings, right now, but I find that the rape in Game of Thrones it doesn't move the story forward very much. Like, I find that it's used as there's three, like I was reading, I read a lot of stuff on the internet, but there's three different ways that female characters are done. They're whores, they're nobility, and they're rape victims. And basically everybody in all the books is raped all the time. And it's partially to show that there's these evil characters and they're really evil, but I mean, even in righteous ways where like poor people are, I mean, I was just reading, poor people were rising up against the Lannisters, and then one of the nobility girls ended up getting raped by 50 guys. And in some ways it's kind of gratuitous. Like I don't want to hear, when I'm reading a book, I don't want to read about how somebody's being gang raped on a bunch of corpses in every single chapter that I read it. It's not moving the story forward. Whereas an example where it does, another book I was reading, and the best books that I've read this year were Orcs and Crake and The Year of the Flood by Margaret Atwood. Those books were so good. And so as I was reading Orcs and Crake, I got about a third through it, and I found it almost too much. Like it's pretty, the sexual violence in those books is sick. And I actually had to put it down for a little while, and then I picked it up again. But as I read, it really did move the story forward, and you really got an impression of how horrible this dystopia was. And even the female characters, Ren was working at this high-end sex club, had no empathy for any of the other sex workers that weren't the talent that she was. Like, in that case, I liked it. Like, I didn't like it. But, you know, it was a good storytelling, but in Game of Thrones, it just seems to be, I don't get it.
From a standpoint of sexual violence in all media, and I don't know that this is necessarily restricted to science fiction and fantasy, but sexual violence is a reality of our life for obvious reasons. Women are predominantly the victims of a lot of those crimes. What happens in a lot of our culture that we consume is it gets added in kind of as a world-building concept. It doesn't get any commentary, it's just a thing that happens. And sometimes it is a thing that happens, but I think the most responsible media, no matter what you're talking about, that deals with sexual violence, tries to deal with it in such a way that there is a level of commentary, a level of deep thought that goes into why are we including this? Is it just because, like I think you're saying in Game of Thrones, because it's sort of background, it's like a set piece, it's just a part of the story, in which case it doesn't really feel like there's any motivating reason for it to be there or any reflective quality to it? Or is it included in something like Dollhouse, another Joss Whedon show, where there's a lot of undertones and grayscales there about sexual violence and about agency, but there's a lot of choices made in that show that are on a level of commentary. So when something happens, when Sierra awakens and has to deal with her, essentially the person who put her in the dollhouse and basically is raping her on a regular basis, so that he puts her in the dollhouse so that she gets her mind wiped so that he can have sex with her whenever he wants, is essentially how that storyline goes. When she wakes up and has to acknowledge this and confront him, it's not dealt with as a typical revenge story. There are consequences there for all of the characters involved in making that choice. It's not dealt with as just a sort of side venture of the show. Sex is dealt with very, very consciously in Dollhouse, and it's people, Joss Whedon and the other writers try and use it in a way to make you think about sexual violence, in a way that makes you try and think about sex in our culture and about the ways that sex is acceptable or unacceptable. In the sex worker industry, how that may be acceptable and unacceptable. And some of the male characters in the Dollhouse go through the same kind of having their sexual agency removed that the women characters do, which is not something we see or talk about. But there is a male sex worker industry that is vibrant and as big as the female sex industry. And they discuss that in Dollhouse, which makes it a very unique show because everything there is on purpose and it's thoughtful.
And medium matters. Like, I mean, if we go back to Game of Thrones, the difference between the show and the books is that in the show, there's a lot more sex and less rape than there is in the books, which in a way, I mean, like, reading about rape in a book is a little bit different than watching it on screen. So they did tone down the rape in the show, but I mean, maybe it changed it. I haven't seen very much of the show.
But if you're saying that that as long as rape is used in a thoughtful way, in a way that doesn't just act as a plot point to jump from, but is used thoughtfully.
If there needs to be, anytime you're writing something, there needs to be a reason. If you're just writing it because you think it's cool, or like, how many people here are writers or would classify themselves as writers? There's a lot of intention in what you write, and anybody who tries to tell you that is, you probably think is a little bit crazy. Like some of it just kind of flows out of the page and you don't know why, but anyone who writes as a craft knows that once you kind of blah all over the page, you go back and look at what you said and try and figure out why you said it. The best stories always have some thematic elements and always have a layer of intention. And if it's not important, most smart writers and every smart editor will tell you to pull it out. If it's not important to the story, if it doesn't drive the story forward, if it doesn't say something about a character, if it doesn't reveal character, then it gets pulled out. And it should get pulled out because story writing and creation of media isn't just about it's not just about doing it because it's cool. I mean, people are actually trying to say something in it.
And using those tropes it's lazy writing, and it shows up, like, even with the original question about, I mean, in science fiction, you can do anything. You can have any kind of world with any kind of characters. Why have everybody heterosexual? I mean, why have it based on the same, like, European culture? You can do anything, and to fall back on those it's unoriginal and it's uninteresting.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, and who here wants questions at the end? Okay, so I'll do both that this time. So let's talk about fandom a bit. We hear a lot that the fan community and the geek community and the science fiction and fantasy community, that it's, this horrible space where sexism runs rampant, and if anybody just watched the panel before us or the presentation before us, you could assume that. But is that the case or not?
No, sexism is everywhere. It's not in science fiction and fantasy. I mean, although it is amplified with the huge boobs, but the world is pretty sexist. So it's not a personal attack on anybody that really likes science fiction or fantasy. It's just something that kind of just ended up being that way. But in a way, like, can't we be better than that? Like, can't we make up new worlds that aren't sexist? Like, let's not be sexist. It's not that hard. Like,
Sound exasperated.
I mean, like I said before, it's lazy, like, think of something new, do something different.
It really gets exemplified as far as sexism goes in things like, I'm sure anybody here who's a gamer who has played like RPG games and stuff will notice the difference between male armor and female armor. And you have to wonder to yourself, are the females in those stories have skin made of stone? Because they're not wearing very much to protect themselves. And as a female who likes to play these games and who likes a female character, it is incredibly frustrating to have to pick a female character who is, a tank, big, bulky. They're going to go in there with their giant sword, and they're wearing, like, basically nipple covers. Like, really?
Yeah,
Would that pulls the realism out of it and makes me feel very objectified, even as a character in a game who has a role like that. And the same thing can be said of all medias. Look at your basic cop drama show, your buddy cop drama show. Every time there's a female cop, Castle, I love the show, it drives me crazy because Kate Beckett in Castle wears these frickin' 3-inch heels for everything she does, which is incredibly unrealistic. And that's very, very frustrating as a female to look at these things and see choices made for female characters to sex them up rather than out of practicality. One of my favorite shows that kind of borders on the sci-fi kind of fantasy element is a show called Chuck. And one of the things I like about it is the female lead in that show, she wears practical shoes most of the time. If she's going on a raid, she's dressed the same way the guys are. She wears flat shoes, and when she has to go to a party undercover, she wears the high heels and she wears the ball gown. But you know what she does as soon as she has to run or chase somebody? She kicks those shoes off, and they don't always make a big show of it. You'll just see her running down a hallway in bare feet. And that's the kind of realism, and that's the kind of genuine, you don't have to draw attention to it, but it's real. It makes me appreciate the character more because it's practical. You couldn't chase the bad guy, through the hallways of a mansion with 3-inch heels. You gotta be able to move.
And I think that extends, it extends to conferences like this, to conventions. Because if you're going to engage in cosplay, a lot of your choices have very little clothing, right? So how does that does that disadvantage the people who want to be involved? And actually, let's use right now to talk about, I'm sorry, the slave Leia controversy. Continuing an ongoing slave Leia. Does anyone not know what I'm talking about? So that saves 5 minutes. So one of the things that I
Well,
find.
some people don't know what it is.
Oh,
I
really?
saw some hands.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Who wants to explain slave Leia? Oh, yeah, I'm looking.
Oh, okay. So basically, if you go to any major cons, things like Dragon Con, there has developed this culture around the slave Leia look, which is always the most popular of the slave Leia costumes. And specifically at some of the bigger cons, there's the slave Leia photo, where anybody who is dressed as an appropriate version, as the like realistic version of slave Leia, gets to be in the picture. And there are actually rules about how authentic your costume has to be before you're allowed to be in that picture. For example, if you are wearing any kind of like nude tights, not allowed in the picture. That is considered non-authentic. So basically the idea of this picture is if you're not willing to literally bear it all, you are not good enough to be in the picture. And some of the photos that come out of this, there are women in those photos who dress as sort of the overly authentic slave Leia, not because they're comfortable with it, and I have no problem with people who dress like that because they're comfortable with it. It's because they feel like they have to, in order to gain the respect of their fellow conference goers. They go farther than they're actually comfortable with, and that I have a problem with.
You look like you want to talk.
Oh, it's, okay. I mean, this is something that we're probably gonna talk about, but there was, they did have this discussion at this conference once before, and somebody went, well, you're just jealous. And like, how do we react to somebody when they say you're just jealous? That just falls into, it's creating a straw man, like, oh, you're just jealous because you're not as hot as these girls that are wearing these scantily clothing. That's not the issue at all. People can wear whatever they want. And when you say that to women, don't say that. Don't make comments on people's physical bodies. Don't call people ugly. Because the moment that you say something like that, it silences them. A lot of women are willing to participate and don't do a lot of things because they're worried about their looks. Like, it's unfortunate. Just don't even.
Well, and that's what's interesting is a lot of the discussion of the slave Leia costume is between women. So there's definitely elements of, well, if you wear the costume, there's some slut shaming happening. But if you decide not to wear the costume, it's because you're, I don't know, ugly, jealous, and a lesbian.
It falls into.
Isn't that what we go to?
It's not just, I don't think it's just between women. I think there's also a culture of, and it's in society, not just like in nerd fandom, but in society about like, if you're not sexy, then you shouldn't have a voice, or you aren't acknowledged. And when I started attending conventions and realized that people dress like this, I was like, this is another area of my life where I have to be sexy? Are you kidding me? Like, that's ridiculous. I want to talk about books. So I think that, like, it's not just between women. I think there's also a pressure where there's some pressure to be sexy from culture in general.
And again, reproducing those tropes, right? So now we have 15 minutes left. Is that enough time for questions?
Sure. Okay, some comments actually. I really appreciate what you said about 709 because what really pissed me off was the fact, hey, she's a board character. That's cool. Okay. Then you put on her in this sexy, skimpy uniform saying, okay, you know what? Enough of this crap. Okay? I want to see a character, put her in a uniform, make her part of the crew. Because I'm sick and tired of saying, oh, I'm a guy, and saying, oh, great, we got to put this woman in this sexy outfit for me to pay attention to her. And I thought there was some real potential with her, because what I saw with that character was the actress there, she was, I don't remember the episode, she had different personalities coming out. She was a Klingon at one point, a little girl, a little, to me that interested me because here it is, she was, I remember taking, at 12 years old, she was made a Borg, grew up as a Borg, and then came back to the human world, back to society. And I thought, okay, that's something I thought was really interesting. But we're really just just offended me was, okay, don't think I'm stupid, or just put her and make her look hot.
But I would say that that was the Borg Queen as well.
Yeah.
Why the need to sexualize the Borg Queen?
I would, Star Trek is, I love Star Trek. It's why I love science fiction, but it makes huge mistakes with gender representation.
Well, it's a huge problem with all science fiction and fantasy. Can you think of one truly grotesque, truly alien female character in a series?
No, because even with B'Elanna Torres, they pulled back the Klingon there.
She's only half Klingon.
She's half Klingon, and I think they did that because they felt a fully fledged Klingon female character would be too ugly to be accepted
Yeah, I was
by
thinking
the
of Star Trek,
fans.
just female monsters,
One
female aliens, just.
No, that's a
In
really,
general.
yeah, that's a
One
really good
example,
point.
and it's probably the only one, was Delenn from Babylon 5 before they gave her hair. And that character, when they originally wrote it, they wanted it to be like a male character, but they were going to give it a female voice, just because they were trying to do something kind of interesting with the aliens, but then they gave her hair.
I would also invite you to think very carefully about how many, not just in science fiction and fantasy, but how many non-sort of typical body, like non-sort of skinny, standardly, I don't even know how to word it, how many different body types of women you see in culture represented. And compare that with how many times you see someone with a shape. A perfect example is Adama. He's a very sort of barrel-chested, larger man. Like he's not necessarily fat, but he's a big man. And you almost never see something like that represented in a female character who isn't evil.
Don't you understand? They have different hair.
But female body types are seen, it's the same female body type every time, and it's not the same way with men. Men are allowed to not be kind of traditionally beautiful, whereas women characters always have to have that standard of beauty. And when they're considered mousy, it's just they have like
They just need to
stringy
get
hair
their
and glasses.
straightened. And
Question
take
in
the
the
glasses
back?
off.
You mentioned the fact that Janeway doesn't take any lovers as a positive trait, but is there any concern that this is because her being the captain would create a power dynamic that maybe the writers weren't comfortable with, or that maybe there was a bit of a Madonna horror complex thing going on and they wanted to keep her chaste for respectability reasons, rather than just not wanting to portray another romantic woman?
You know, they do, women's sexuality in TV and movies, they punish women's sexuality. So, you know, you could really be right about that. I mean, it's not often where you'll see a character where they're a female that's sexual, where it's not used as a weapon, which is another trope. You know, like the Borg Queen's a really good example of that, or they're being raped. But yeah, you could be totally right about that.
We have so many potential storylines.
Okay, I just wanted to talk about the Starbuck from the new original Battlestar Galactica. I think she's a very difficult character to discuss in terms of what gender role she represents, because it runs the risk of saying that Starbuck is too masculine. Well, what is masculine? Is masculine male or is masculine female? Are these traits gendered? And there's sometimes you might run the risk of saying that, oh, we have to worry about the positive traits of female characters and about sacrificing their femininity, instead of considering the fact that maybe femininity and masculinity are not necessarily gendered. And this female character does embody masculine traits, and feminine traits don't necessarily have to be there because she's female, but that feminine traits could be considered ideal for both male and female characters. I'm kind of being confusing here, but I'm just trying to think about the ways one can approach a critique of Starbuck to say this character is too much like a man. It makes me feel really uncomfortable when someone talks that way about a fictional character, to say that there is a limit on how much masculinity a female character can have, or they seem unrealistic, or that they're too much that way.
What I really like about Starbuck is I think they push the masculinity of her character really, really far, like way farther than a lot of people would do it. She is in that really good episode where they fight. There's lots of fights that are going on to kind of settle disputes, especially among the soldier ranks. They push her quite far, and she's, you know, it's very rare that you see a fight like that involving a female character who is not only getting punishment, but giving it, as far as in a physical battle. Usually when women get beat in media, it's because they're getting beat. It's not because they're also giving a beating. And what I really like about Starbuck is they pushed her as far as they could into a traditionally masculine role, but also let her have, she was in some cases very female. When she grew her hair out a little bit, I quite enjoyed that trait of hers because it allowed her to be physically more female and without having to say, if you're going to be a masculine female character, you gotta have like the short cropped hair and kind of have the butch look.
And was that important because it made her more multifaceted, or because it didn't take her too far?
I think it's because they say we can take this single character trait, which is that she's a fighter and she's brash, and push that far without having to bring all of these other things with it. You can have someone who has a diverse set of character traits. They didn't necessarily inherently assume that because she is a fighter, that she then also has to be this. She can be both at once.
And so would you say that it's not about that a character has to have a certain level of femininity or to feel like they've sacrificed something, just that they have to combine feminine and masculine traits, and that's a better...
I don't think they have to do anything. I don't know about you guys, but I think that there's just as good a characters who are very feminine without having to embody any of those masculine pieces. I like that about Starbuck. I want to see more variety. I don't necessarily want to see all strong female characters having to kick ass. I think there's a way to be a well-written, well-rounded female character without having to be a Buffy or a Starbuck or a Zoe.
And is that applicable to male characters too? That
Yeah,
they all
totally.
don't have to kick ass?
So give me some examples then of females who are actually feminine, who would still be considered sort of strong feminist characters.
Kaylee does not know how to kick ass. She is inherently a
she's a
non-feminine
mechanic.
But she's not gonna go out and do battle with somebody.
No, and they in fact very specifically show her not being comfortable with the idea and really not being able to do it.
She really loves pretty dresses.
Yeah.
Question in the back.
I'm not sure if she was mentioned at the beginning, but what were your thoughts on Samantha Carter from the Stargate universe?
I don't know, Stargate.
I don't know, Stargate.
Oh,
Wow.
Tell us.
Because initially they portray her as a intelligent woman who is part of the Air Force, and she sort of goes out of her way to sort of show that she can play with the guys. In fact, in the pilot episode, she makes a comment of just because reproductive organs are on the inside and not the outside doesn't make her any less than them. And then, I believe it's the third or fourth episode of the first season, they show her dealing with traditional aspects of femininity when they go to a planet that was basically a medieval Mongolian population, and just sort of how she dealt with that, and how, for the sake of the mission and establishing relations, she sort of submitted temporarily, but just to keep the potential peace. But when it came to it, she sort of reverted to the fact that she was a trained Air Force soldier.
You know, and this is actually making me think about something. So is it the case then that we would consider someone a feminist character if they are well-rounded and multifaceted?
That's basically it.
Is honestly, is that all that's required?
That's all it is. Yeah, and it's good writing, because if you don't acknowledge those traits, you're missing out on potential story opportunities and overarching story characteristics. I really like your point about being able to embody masculine and feminine traits, and not necessarily being a man or a woman. You know, like part of my judgment for my feminist characters was, are they able to embody whatever gender, whatever masculine or feminine traits they want or they need to at the time. So it's the ability to be a whole person like we are.
Any more questions? Oh, sorry, Denise?
Oh, hey. So this might be kind of a naive question because I'm extremely new to sci-fi, but is there anything on television in sci-fi or fantasy that's dealing with white privilege and showing women of color in significant ways?
Not as much as there should be.
Well, what are some examples? Like, if somebody can think of some?
I know one that doesn't do it very well. Firefly has some problems there.
Yeah.
Firefly professes to be a humanity that is half Chinese and half white, for the most part, it's like Western world and Asian cultures insofar as they bring the language in. But you'll notice that there are no Asian characters on the show, that they bring the Asians in only as background fodder for when they dock at a station or that kind of thing. And if you actually look at the character of Zoe, there's a lot of good things about the character of Zoe, but she also embodies this kind of trope of the black woman, the tough black woman that is dangerous as well. So from a racial perspective, she doesn't hold up as well as she may from a feminist perspective.
Star Trek tries.
Yeah.
Roddenberry's always been really adamant on showing a future where people of all races work together equally. So attempting to portray women of color is a side effect of this because Star Trek's, I think as we've discussed, not that great with women. But you brought up Keiko O'Brien is a good example.
As Chief O'Brien's wife.
Chief O'Brien's wife on
But
Space Nine.
she's also like a botanist, and it was part of my point about Chief O'Brien and his relationship with Keiko is that they kind of share their relationship equally, their parenting responsibilities. And she's a Japanese lady, they get married under a Japanese ceremony.
There's a lot better examples in literature.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would highly recommend Octavia Butler, that if you haven't explored any of her work so far, that would, and probably in recent literature, The Wind-Up Girl would be what I would most recommend if you're looking for that type of action.
But yeah, and also in terms of challenging white privilege, Star Trek again like does try to do that. Yeah. In terms of storylines too, like not always like. I think later on, especially in Deep Space Nine, they always try to portray like Federation isn't always right, and Starfleet isn't always right, and like I wanted them to do more with the Maquis because they were
so interesting.
yeah, there was such potential there to challenge what Starfleet had become, what it is. Yeah, so it tries.
I was just curious if you guys thought that, considering the recent female characters, that female characters are actually more difficult to write than male characters.
I don't know that they're more difficult. I would say that a lot of people don't, what am I looking for? They're not more difficult to write because a character is a character, right? Like let's take Harry Potter, for example. There's really no reason that Harry Potter had to be a male character. You could have easily, there's nothing dependent upon Harry being a boy, other than I think it was targeted, it sort of sprung up that way, or there's, cultural reasons that he's a boy.
But
in
to
general,
also point out, in Alien, Ripley was supposed to be a boy.
yeah. So there's no reason that you couldn't have swapped Harry Potter's gender and written the same story. The story would have still held up with a gender swap in place.
That wouldn't have been as popular.
That's the question.
Can men identify with a female character the way that women and men identify with male characters?
There's the problem, especially when you're getting into books and young adult books, that if the book has a female protagonist, it gets labeled chick lit. Doesn't matter what the story is, it doesn't matter if it's sci-fi, fantasy, it doesn't matter if she's, slaughtering people or whatever. If there's a female protagonist, it gets labeled chick lit, it goes on a different shelf, it gets buried, and it doesn't get the same prominence. And that happens.
It's the same with like black characters and gay
Totally, it
characters.
happens throughout the industry. There's a problem with whitewashing casts and whitewashing book covers, where books actually have, and this happens all the time in young adult fiction, books actually have a lead character who is not white, and yet the book covers show a white person. And that happens quite a lot, because people don't think that anybody will buy those books, or that they'll watch a show that has a female protagonist.
And that's what I found interesting, the presentation right before us. The gentleman mentioned that the one video game that didn't do well, and people had assumed it was because there was a female lead. The thing is, if a video game doesn't do well and it has a male lead, no one blames it on having a male lead. I find that interesting, that automatically you go to the must be a chick thing. And there was...
Oh yeah, I was going to add to something about Star Trek and the race. What I'm told is the interracial kiss. I don't know the actual details of it, but between Kirk and Uhura, I guess some of the executives, I'm told, wanted it to be with a white woman.
Yeah.
And the way the story goes is that Shatner sabotaged every single shot that wasn't with Uhura, so they had to use the
The
iteration.
history of that shot actually is quite interesting, because it was the first, that moment when Uhura and Kirk in the original series kiss. That was the first biracial kiss ever seen on television, the very first. And there was quite a lot of controversy that happened, but in general, it's acknowledged that that kiss, that groundbreaking territory, could only have happened in sci-fi, because there's already this suspension of disbelief that we give sci-fi, this sort of futuristic appeal where, okay, we can let that happen. But what's interesting about that is the executives wouldn't let that kiss stand unless they were not doing it of their own free will. That kiss is in a context where both Uhura and Kirk are being controlled by an alien. So it's not something that they do out of their own choice. They're basically being puppeted. And that was the only palatable way that they could get away with it, which says a lot about the time.
And we are completely out of time. Thanks to everyone for coming.
This one line Lord has in the Expendables is, a man's just a man, but a woman stands for something. And I'm like, no, that's entirely wrong. It's the wrong attitude. Yeah. And that's the thing. It's true, but it shouldn't be true. Is I guess. I think I read the article you're talking about. You mentioned Georgia.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I
The
know.
picture of the movie, they don't go any info and
What's this?
it is on a site called because a lot of
What's her name?
female characters, but really strong characters.
Yeah, I remember that one. She takes care of her own, she does her best.
She's got the weird memory thing. She was a Cassidy. She was a very strong, very well-rounded character. She was the captain of her own ship. And so that almost put her in some minds on par with this. Yeah.
Yeah. I gotta watch this because I just watched that one.
This is what we did. I wanted to tell everybody, we did this at the bar.
I highly suggest that you haven't had a chance to watch either Stargate Atlantis or SG-1, because there's also a character in Atlantis that's similarly strong to Carter, but she's actually a leader among her people. She's joined, and she's actually physically stronger than the leader of the Atlantis.
Well, it's a question too of some
Is
people
Northern
bring up the historical accuracy argument, which I think is a lot of
We're talking about a
And also, well,
there's no dragons in the medieval times, so why I really disagree with you so much on this, like, it's used to depict very violence. And that's, I don't find it gratuitous,
human
I don't find
resources
we're
person
talking.
for the Pentagon.
Yeah, I don't, in Game of Thrones, I don't think it's gratuitous, I think it's used in very specific circumstances to advance a character over interesting characters. Because it's a violent culture. I do like Game of Thrones.
I would think you guys might have beat each other at any point. There was none of that.
I don't like it, but it doesn't mean I don't like it.
Janeway has holiday sex.
She does with her husband.
No, there's one there, and there was a character, there's a whole episode dedicated to romance. I think there's, yeah.
But they wasn't interested.
It wasn't a full house, but it was, they were. But she wasn't asexual.
But I thought,
No, she wasn't. She was
clear at some point, because he realized she couldn't with anyone else. So hey, would you like to get with me? Because they were stranded on that planet for
Yeah, well, that was
She was
something.
in like, they were so far away. So it was
It's difficult with Voyager because it kind of depends on the authorial intent there. Like, did they intend to write her that way because they felt like her character would not want to cross that line as the captain, or did they write it that way out of some kind of unconscious? Like, that would be an interesting conversation to have with the writers and be like, why did you choose that?
I'd
Why did
also,
you have a long
yeah, I'd also like to look at the gender divide of the writers over the series.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the Star Trek writers is doing this.
Well, what's interesting about
Well, not the original series, I mean,
Yeah.
DC Montana was.
Combination where you do a series where there are episodes, and so many different authors, even though there's a book you're supposed to follow for character development, it varies so much. Whereas, when you look at writers of books or short stories, where you've got recurring characters within a story, I know this characters, sometimes you, at least the same author, dream moves in. And with characterization, is interesting. Friday.
It's fascinating to me that female characters, more than male characters, are so polarizing.
Yeah.
Right? You either like them or hate them. There doesn't seem to be middle ground with characters, which I find really fascinating. I see it play out, right? Like, you see it play out in every single fandom. There are very few places where you're like, I hate that stupid male character. I really like him.
Well,
You
I
don't
think
have
the
that
ones that you
conversation.
two are cheating and glossed over. In fact, when you
Yeah.
mentioned Torres, to me, it's really odd. She's a very good feminist.
She's a really, like, what I like about
Yeah.
Voyager.
No, and you
Yeah.
question
Yeah.
who she is or what she's doing.
No.
Never.
And what's really great about, what I really like about Voyager is that what I like about Voyager overall is it's a story that's driven at least as much by women, if not more so, than by men.
But, again.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
right, Tom?
Yeah, Tom
He
and
actually sees the weaker of the two in that relationship. I mean,
And he's the one that drives the emotional resonance
You know
of
that
that.
I know. The man, the like,
Which
makes
they
me
didn't
sad.
have to do, right?
Yeah,
They're
it's
choosing to
amazing.
make the
Yeah.
Klingon
This
sexual
is
violence.
the way they're kissing out characters.
So, I cried so much.
I had an episode with a great quote. This great quote.
These issues.
From
So
After
going
Elton.
back to,
It's like a
when I heard the
Canadian pop culture website.
security
This
officer,
great quote about
excellent,
him,
this is
where
going
he's
to
like,
be Machiavellian and heartless
he
and
is
logically
a
brutal.
game master's worst nightmare. Queer, weapon-wielding, ass-kicking superhero, gleefully chewing his way through awesome fights.
This is going to be
You know,
great.
when I think that,
It's like, oh,
I don't think I have time to
Did
do this, but I
nothing
really want to.
with
because
that,
I
really,
want to,
I mean,
because
he's not pushing the,
It would have been interesting to see if Vulcan embodied that kind of character.
you know, the completely illogical tactician. It's like,
I think that we could do
we're
like
just
a
looking, we have something in
half-hour
engineering that's
broadcast
got a little
every
just
second
like
week
with
on
gas
feminist
and
and science
lose
fiction.
2%
Yes,
of
every
engineering, but it's
every
acceptable,
once in
it's
a
acceptable
while,
loss.
and you could see every once in a while they pushed him a little bit there, but
But
never where they should
never where
have.
they should have, exactly.
Yeah, that would be fun.
And actually, to
And so, I mean, this
Then
is
you
like,
show every weekend, it's
well,
very
it's
easy.
hard,
It's
but
really
how in
fascinating.
the series, they
Don't
have
anybody finish
initial
it.
doing, but it is the audience. Right, in this game, I mentioned that the message, I mean,
Here's an hour.
most of what you guys have talked
An hour.
about, obviously,
And it has to be
you're
exactly
doing this for
60 minutes,
pop,
right?
things, but
Exactly.
most of them are
Anyway, but,
television series or
if you did it like every
adaptations
2
from
weeks,
television.
like you did it
as opposed to, like,
bi-weekly,
Chris
and you had
Williams.
like kind of a rotating.
Somebody
That'd be interesting.
flamboyantly gay character, warrior best, swords and players, like,
You could have
no
talked
way you're getting that made into
No, that's the thing.
series because it is just way too graphic.
Which is why I'm saying, don't talk about it.
But,
Yeah, did you
yeah,
see that?
I mean,
You
as
had like
that,
a quarter of a different
for
question.
certain tropes, because, or, for example, William, who's a
That's what I'm saying.
Earth series as well.
Did you?
Yeah.
And you look a little.
Racial issues.
Thinking about things.
And I knew
Right, but it's just.
Denise and I started watching Star Trek together.
Fantasy,
It's fun, we
but she doesn't.
I got
Really, yeah.
So
I'm just doing like,
another issue,
we're just
why
doing
we
certain
use these
episodes right
tropes.
now.
the good ones,
People
and it's
get
hard when you're like, it's so good, and then you start watching.
Some writers are like,
We definitely, cause not for Jordan and I, we were like,
But when you
oh,
get
let's
television,
do
it's
the
a lot of
next
writers are
generation
watered
down.
down
It's a
by-
good idea. And then
Sure,
we're like,
sure.
we were
that
sat
to
down,
be safe and trying to appeal to.
I forgot how like mom.
You don't need to
talk to
develop a real reason to
Yeah.
how this would work for
and TNG.
If you talk to a lot of writers, they will tell you that producers have told them upfront, philosophy, seriously, I'm not a white male protagonist. We're not gonna
I
pretend
hated him,
nobody wants
I hated him, and I think he was in it too. Oh,
This is
they
our
opened
law
up like the window to the ship.
Yeah.
Who are you selling to?
With bubbles around.
Yeah, there's this idea that,
It was my favorite episode, and then I watched it
that's
again.
that's where most people.
Yes,
That's the
it was so
demographic.
dumb, it was like the worst story, but I
There's
remember,
the
I was
houses
just,
down the,
I
the
loved
hall.
that, and then I watched it again, and I was like,
The
my favorite
first book.
episode was
But